All right. Hello, everyone. We have a couple minutes before I will start right at 7 p.m. So if you want to grab a quick drink from the kitchen, you still have some time. And we will get rolling with a webinar on bike fit and setup. And I'm going to be focusing mostly on mountain bike fit and setup tonight. But there should be hopefully, some helpful tips for the cross riders and road riders out there as well. Hello, everyone. We have a couple minutes before I will start right at 7 p.m. And it sounds like the volume is working, which is good. If you're just joining in, thank you for joining, and we will get rolling in just another minute or so, just allowing a few more people to join in. Tonight's webinar is going to be on bike fit and setup of that bike, and I'm going to take you through the process I use to set up a bike and to set up a mountain bike more specifically, but you can use these same steps for a cross bike as well. Obviously, you don't have suspension, but and a few just some of the Coles notes of fitting a bike. We're not going to go too in depth. I'm not going to necessarily be talking about precise angles of joints and things like that, but just some common themes in bike fitting that we can use and things that you and I may take for granted. Some of this might be common knowledge to you, but it never ceases to amaze me when I head to a mountain bike race or a bike race at all, is just to see some riders out there that might be well outside of what could be expected out of a good bike fit, out of a good, efficient, and safe bike fit. We're going to give it another minute and then I'll dive in. So, thank you for joining me tonight, Monday night. This is a regular Monday night webinar that I hope to do for the rest of the winter and into the spring, depending on how things all shake out. So yes, thanks again for joining in. And we are coming up right on around 7 o'clock. So I will start rolling, and a few more people might join, and that's great. So quickly about me, I was a professional cyclist for a number of years with some great professional teams and rode with the national team as well and learned a lot there. And over the course of a few years, I transitioned from being a full-time cyclist to a full-time cycling coach. And that's where I am today. So, and this is just a way for me to keep some structure in my week and hopefully pass along some helpful information to other people out there, and some of my contact emails there. If you do want to email me, andrew@awicoaching.com. Should be pretty straightforward. Okay, who do I focus on with my business as a coach? Masters athletes who are trying to balance many different things in a busy schedule. Younger high performance athletes who are aiming to compete at a very high level. I also do custom one-off training plans for folks and do some skills development at all as well in the summer. And that's probably my thing I love to do the most, is get out there with people and build skills, whether it's one-on-one in privates or I do run some clinics as well. All right, getting right into it. If you have any questions, please ask as we go. There is a little bit of a delay between when I talk and when you hear me talk. So it takes me a little bit. So I might be a slide behind, but I will get to your questions and you can just write those right into the comment box there and I will see them. And tonight's webinar, again, we're talking about bike fit, and I'm just going into the basics of bike fit. We're not going to get too detailed. I'm not going into precise angles of your ankle and your elbow and your pinky finger, nothing like that, just the basics that I think we can all kind of brush up on and remind ourselves, especially if you're getting a new bike and or a new used bike to you, especially depending on where you're coming from. Locally, at least, I know that we don't have a lot of bike fitting services going on due to the pandemic and some of the shutdowns. So some of this might be on us to get through. So super quick, I found this little infographic, and I'm not sure how old it is, but it's actually still so good. I only kind of crossed out one thing, but basically some of these same principles apply, and I would almost just draw these exact same things on somebody, even on a modern bike. And some of the things that we're looking for with a good bike fit is hopefully the bike fits you. And that's called sizing a bike or bike sizing. But then once you have the bike and how you make it fit you is your bike fit. And I always start with the saddle height fore aft. But generally speaking, when you're at the bottom of your pedal stroke, so let's say in this graphic here, that right leg is right at the bottom. You want a slight bend in the knee. And another thing that I look for is where the foot is. And I want that foot to be at least able to go level, if not have a little bit of mobility to drop down and have the heel drop a little bit. So if you're riding, or if you notice somebody else riding, maybe somebody you work with, or maybe your young athlete at home, and they always look like they're reaching for the pedal. They're always pedaling with their toes, and maybe they still have some knee bend. Their saddle might still be a little bit too high. So watch for that. Watch for that heel mobility. You want a little bit of flexibility in the heel. Very important for mountain biking and cyclocross because that can come into cornering, being able to drop that heel when we have that outside foot down. Going up, another thing I look for is the slope of the saddle. For whatever reason, in this one it said upward slope of the saddle, but generally I try to go level or nose down just a little bit, and it doesn't take much. And I find that puts us in a pretty good position, especially to be in a little bit more aggressive position on a road bike, on a cross bike, and even on a mountain bike as well. And yeah, arms slightly bent. We don't want to be too stretched out on the bike. We don't want to be too cramped on the bike. So that comes into how long our stem is on our bike. So that's something that you might have to change on your bike to decrease your reach to not be so stretched out. I see that a lot. Sometimes people buy bikes that maybe are on the size too big for them, but maybe they even have a long stem on them, maybe a 120 or 130 stem on some road bikes, whereas maybe 100 will do. And handlebars. This is a big one. I always think that handlebars should be below your saddle, and you should do whatever you can to get them below your saddle, unless you have a pretty major inflexibility of your back, your hamstring. There could be some reason for that, but generally speaking, handlebars below the saddle. I'm going to show you a good example of an athlete who went to great lengths to make that happen on their bike. All right, going on, we can do a lot with some pretty basic tools. If you have a set of Allen keys or Torx in some cases, some of the newer bars and stems use a Torx key. A level, just a normal spirit level, or your smartphone. Phones usually have some sort of level built in, or you can just download a free app, and a tape measure. So one quick one, how important is standover height? Good one, great question. Standover height, it is important. You do want some standover height. So what that is you're standing on top of the bike, or you're straddling the bike. The top tube is below your legs, both feet on the ground. You want some space between, if you lift up the bar and the saddle, before that top tube hits you in the crotch. So that's really important. You do want some standover height there, just for safety reasons, and it's a good indicator if the bike's too big for you. If you don't have any standover height, there's a good chance you might be at two sizes a bike too high for you. So reach, I don't know if I'd compare reach and standover height. Reach, I think, is much more of a comfort and performance thing, where standover height's a really good tool just for, a quick, hey, throw your leg over this bike, and is it too big? Another good thing is if you're measuring it in bare feet, your standover height's always going to be less. You always want to measure everything, do bike fits, all these things with your cycling shoes on. So if you're using flip flops with a really thin sole, that could throw these off. So make sure you're in your cycling shoes whenever you're doing any bike fitting or bike sizing. So, and a tape measure. So again, we can do a lot. You can adjust your saddle height fore aft with just those things, and that's going to get you about like 75% of the way through a good bike fit. Unfortunately, the bars and stems, you might have to flip a bar or swap a stem out. But again, you could use those same tools, and it's not a bad idea to write little notes to yourself too. In case you do want to change a stem, you can measure your saddle, tip of your saddle to your bar, write that down. Okay, how much of a change was that? Okay, a couple more questions coming in. I was wondering about mountain bike seat height compared to road bike seat height. Seem to set my seat lower for maneuverability, but pedaling doesn't feel as efficient. Okay, great question. So question being, do we set our seat heights, saddle height differently between mountain bike, cross bike, road bike, let's say? Um, you can, especially if you're a beginner mountain biker or you see someone as a beginner, their seat height might be a little bit lower, but it does help with confidence if they can stop and put their whole foot down, their whole flat foot down. But as we gain confidence, the seat height shouldn't be much different, and the angles of our knees and those kinds of things, we do want to get to a point where on a mountain bike, cross bike, we have that maximal efficiency position on the bike, and that's my philosophy, that's my theory, that's what I aim for. But it is okay to have your mountain bike and cross just a little bit lower, rather than higher. I wouldn't go any higher than a road bike for sure. Another quick one regarding mountain bike fit. Is there a way to measure your arms for reach? Not that I'm aware of. I think if you're measuring your arms and trying to get a reach, what could happen is your bar width would also get in the way, and also how you're sitting on the bike. So how flexible you are, how much you're leaning over is going to also adjust your or affect your reach and your comfortable reach. So it's more than just your arm length. The best way is to get on that bike and really feel what's comfortable. And this is a tough one for me to do in webinar format. If I had like pictures of people, I could kind of, profile photos. I could say, okay, maybe that's a bit stretched out. Maybe that's a bit too tight. But really, you want to be comfortable, but you also should be in a fairly position where a lot of your weight is on your saddle. You shouldn't be having to push yourselves off of your bars at any time on any bike. You should actually, at any point in time, and almost in any position, maybe not time trial position, but take your hands off the bars. If you can never take your hands off the bars because you just feel like you're falling into them, then there could be an adjustment there. Um, Mainly with the saddle. The saddle might have to come up, back, tilt up a little bit. But other than that, there's no real way to measure it other than getting on the bike. That's always the best way. So this was the example that I was speaking of, and I use this rider. You might recognize this rider's bike or this rider's former bike. This is Emily Batty's bike. This was 2014. I literally just went and Googled Emily Batty bike, and this was the first thing that popped up was a Bike Radar article. So full credit to them. And it was written by James Huang. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I might not be. And it had a couple great little photos to illustrate some of the things that Emily had to do to make her bike fit her the way she wanted it to. And Emily would have started on a 26-inch bike and probably progressed to a 29er pretty quickly. There probably was no real 650B initially. So quickly, you can actually tell that the saddle is very far forward. It's almost rammed right forward on the rails. And I actually, even in reading the article, they actually even flipped the seat post around to make it less offset. And I'll get to offset soon. And that's to make sure that her hips and her knees are over her pedals where she wants them to be. Emily's a fairly short rider. She's about 5'3". And then this is like a very small frame, 29-inch wheels, which jacks up the front end. So the other thing they had to do was put a really drop stem on. So that's a negative 25-degree rise stem. But you can see that if they didn't do that, if they put a flat stem on, the bars would be higher than the saddle. It might even be like much higher. So it's all an attempt to keep those bars, relatively speaking, below that saddle. And I think that's kind of what they were aiming for here. So just a good real world example, professional athlete who they had to modify, work around these bigger wheels, longer stack height, head tubes, those kinds of things. So. Okay, so what do I mean by stack height and reach and all those things? So on the left are a couple examples of stems. The top stem might be something that you would find on any bike. Fairly level, it might be a -5, -7. But depending on your bike fit, you might have to go to something, at the bottom the second stem down. And that is a negative 25 or a plus 25. And that will help you get your bar where you want it to be. And those stems will also come in different lengths as well to fine tune where you are on the bike. And if you ever go and get a new bike or a new used bike to you, it's a great idea to budget in some money to switch some of these parts around on a bike, because you might take it to a bike fitter and they'll say that, and I recommend that this webinar is not a substitute for a good professional bike fit, but they might say, hey, you know what, this is, the bike is the right size for you, but we have to add some length to this. We had to have some reach. You might have to purchase a new stem. So always keep that in mind when you're purchasing a new bike, is you might have to make some tweaks. So on the right-hand side are a couple seat posts. So the left seat post, it says turbine on it. It's a race face seat post. It has 0 setback on it, which means that the seat is about neutral with the post itself. So it's not really in front of the post or behind the post. That's great for typically a shorter rider, a rider who has shorter femurs. I typically tend to ride a post with a 0 setback on it. I don't need a lot of layback on it. I want that seat to be a little bit more forward. The one on the right is a layback seat post or a setback seat post. So you can see where the center of the seat, if it was centered on the rails, would actually be behind the seat post in the frame. So you're effectively making your bike longer by using a setback seat post. So these are the things, a couple of things that you can change on a bike to make it fit you a little bit better, a little bit more comfortably, get you into a nice range of fit, and a range of angles. So a couple more quick ones. Would you recommend bars below the saddle on a gravel bike? Yes, I would. I would recommend them, and if the top of the bar, the tops, I would recommend them to be either saddle height or a little bit below. It's not a hard and fast rule by any means, but that is what I'd recommend. Unless it's really uncomfortable for you, then it's totally okay to have them above. But especially if you're not necessarily racing, maybe you're a little bit more comfort oriented, touring, that kind of thing. But generally speaking, try to start with them around level and go from there. Another quick one, if I was getting a mountain bike now, is there a certain wheel size limit for height inseam? I wouldn't say so. There's no hard and fast rule. Like I said, we used Emily's bike here as an example. That's a 29er. And I know that she has used some 650Bs, I think even since this, but the bikes have gotten better, and they've gotten better at fitting them to a shorter rider, so they can start to, a person who's 5 foot could ride a 29er pretty comfortably and get in that range without necessarily needing a negative 25. So there's no real, I wouldn't say go with what's comfortable. If you love that 29er and you can get that 29er to fit you, and if you're on the shorter side, then go for it. Absolutely. And same thing for gravel. Go with what you want, and usually we can build the bikes around people to get a good fit and good performance. But know that you might have to change that flat stem. You might have to drop some spacers, things like that, to get into a good aggressive position. So moving on quickly, and if you are just joining us, ask questions as we go, and I'll try to weave them in and answer as I go. Another big one, this is huge, saddles. Everyone's butt and sit bones and nether regions are different, and everyone's going to use a slightly different saddle. What works for one person might not work for the other person. So this is a Bontrager saddle, and if you ever go into a shop, especially if you go into a Trek store or a shop that sells Specialized, those brands, you go in, there's usually a wall of different saddles, different models, different widths, those kinds of things, and usually they'll have demo saddles to try. My advice is try as many saddles as you can, and ask your buddies, ask your riding buddies, hey, do you have any saddles kicking around? Or if you notice your buddy has a new saddle, say, hey, what did you do with the old one? Mind if I give it a try? and get out your level and get out your measuring tape and make sure that you're, by putting on a new saddle, you're not changing your fit too much. And try that different saddle. You might find it a little bit more comfortable. There, you can also get fit for saddle as well at bike shops. Some of them have even really high tech butt measuring mapping that they can, figure out hot spots on your sit bones and nether regions, private areas, those kinds of things, and figure out what the best saddle is for you. So I highly recommend this. And I can't say this enough because I know people, friends, and they they constantly are numb down there, or they have, bleeding or cuts and things like that. And it shouldn't be that way. You should not have a lot of saddle discomfort if you're just riding for several hours. And I say that just several hours. Like when we start to talk about ram riders and people 24-hour racers, we might have to get a little bit more dialed. But for in general, no one should have to go numb after an hour or two on a bike. There's something up with the fit, how you're sitting on the bike, or your saddle. So try a different saddle. It is worth, if you can find the saddle that works for you, then I suggest buying a few of those saddles and stock up on them because they might even discontinue it and you might have to figure out what's the next saddle that works for you. So please, by all means, don't feel like you have to suffer a bad saddle. Find that saddle that works for you. Another quick ones. And yeah, tips for saddles. Usually the ones with cutouts are great. They can relieve some pressure. Yeah, saddle, those ones can also allow a lot of road spray to go up. And if it's a cold, wet day, you don't necessarily want road spray shooting up between your legs. So you can also block, you can put some tape that down there. You can put a little fender in there to block that off. So another quick one, how do you balance the tack position so you don't feel like you're going to go out the front door on a steep down, attack the chute and not do old school bum over back wheel? So I think you're talking about mountain bikes there, Len. And a lot of that one is, we're not so much talking about bike fit, maybe a little bit on bar height and stem. A lot of that comes down to hinging at the hips. Hinging at the hips so that our hips might be going back, but our chest is lowering and going a little bit more parallel with the bike. So their center of mass is still over the bottom bracket. That's what we always want. And bike fit will play into that a little bit, but no matter the bike fit, you should be able to find that spot where your balance, center mass over the BB, that's the balance point. No matter if you're climbing, descending, what bike you're on. Another quick one, when setting saddle tilt, do you level the nose of the saddle or entire saddle? So I would, it'd be tough to do one without the other. Oh, okay, I see what you're saying, Adam. I would measure the entire saddle to start with and then go from there because some saddles will flex more than others. So almost do both. But generally speaking, yes, I think that the nose of the saddle should be nose down just a little bit, but start with the whole saddle. Road saddle versus mountain bike saddle. There is no, really, in my opinion, there is no such thing. A road saddle can work on the mountain bike. If a mountain bike saddle works for you on the road, use it on the road bike. Yeah, I have the same, but I have the same saddles on all my bikes. I kind of took my own advice. I found a saddle that works for me, and it's on 4 different bikes, from cross to road to mountain bikes. So it's the really important thing is finding the seat that works for you and getting a few of them. Are women's specific seats a gimmick? No, they aren't. They really aren't. Especially, there's two considerations there. One, sometimes women often have wider hips, so sometimes they'll ride a slightly wider saddle, and that's why saddles might come in different widths. They might have a 135 width, a 143, a 150. So there's that consideration, and also how a woman sits on the saddle, without getting too detailed and graphic. They sit on the saddle a little bit different than a man, and yes, it is important to have to make sure that that's comfortable. But I would definitely give a woman specific saddle a try if there are issues there. I also know men who ride women's specific saddles. I know a bike fitter who rides who's very open. Like, yes, I ride a women's saddle because that's the saddle for me. So give it a try. So again, yeah, road saddle on a mountain bike for sure. My saddle on my mountain bikes are technically road saddles. So there you go. If they're a um, there you go, a specialized mimic. That's a great one. That is a women's specific one. I've heard very good things about those saddles, specialized power saddles, and the power saddle mimic. I've heard very good things there. With no plug, I'm not associated with Specialized in any form whatsoever. But those are a good. That's a good line to look into. Um, there are some considerations with if you have like a really high end road saddle with carbon fiber rails that are kind of funky and unique to a certain road saddle seat post. Those might not work for you on a mountain bike, but in general, yeah, they're interchangeable. And like I said, men's saddles, female saddles, you know, find something that works for you. We're all different down there, air quotes. Um, another quick one. I just want to make sure I didn't blow past my chatter. Another key that I think goes into just enjoying the sport performance is crank length. And something that doesn't get talked about a whole lot when, especially with used bikes. And sometimes you'll buy a used bike that has maybe cranks on it that maybe the person switched over because they wanted a longer crank. Maybe they had longer legs, but maybe you ride that bike, you lower the seat, cramp, you know, shorten it up a little bit, or you have really long arms, which makes you fit that bike. So when in doubt with crank length, is I always say it's better to go shorter than longer. So if you have the opportunity to try different cranks of different lengths, you might notice a difference with going to a shorter crank. So if you have a 172, a 170 might be better for you. You might feel a little bit more like your pedal strokes a little bit freer. And what I mean that by that, especially if you're coming over the top of your pedal stroke, so you are at the top and your foot's just pushing forward and then you're about to push down, having a shorter crank can make that transition a little bit easier and might actually smooth out your pedal stroke. Another benefit of having shorter cranks is more pedal clearance, especially for us off-road riders, mountain bikers, downhillers, cross riders. We can pedal further through stuff without hitting our pedals or cranks on things. I race cross on 165s. I'm a fairly average cyclist. I'm 5'9". Don't have crazy short legs by any means, but I've been experimenting with shorter cranks, and I really do like it, especially on the cross bike. I can pedal through corners like nobody's business. Again, it was an experiment. I saw the cranks come up. I threw them on my bike, and I really do like going to a slightly shorter crank length. I know that can be a point of contention and there's a lot of opinions out there, but in general, if you feel like you're clunky through your pedal stroke and your bike fits good, going to a shorter crank might actually just help you get a little bit smoother through that pedal stroke. A couple more questions coming in. Shorter crank arm, yes, less pedal, more clearance. A few millimeters can make a big difference over rocks, corners, all that stuff. Do saddle noses play in bike handling? Is a Phenom versus? I don't know those two saddles specifically, but I would say if you're climbing on the saddle, if you're climbing on the nose of your saddle, that could change how you climb, from a comfort level. But generally speaking, if we really get into the handling of a bike, we should be off the saddle. Like especially in a mountain bike sense, if things are getting gnarly, we're not even sitting on the saddle. So most of our handling is coming from our bike body separation. So the saddle might not play into it too much. I think of a saddle as being, it needs to fit well and be comfortable to put down power, and think of it kind of that way. Brake setup. This is one that I am going to go into here and preach a little bit about, because this comes into one of the things I do a lot of in season is mountain bike skills with people, beginners, intermediates, advanced riders, and this is one that I see there being a lot of room for improvement over a lot of people that I see throughout a year, and that is how they set up their brakes on a bike. And just going through kind of somewhat quickly, but somewhat concisely. So there's several different ways to adjust our brakes on our bikes. So we can adjust the tilt. So that's how far up the brake levers are or how far down the brake levers are. And generally speaking, when we're on a bike in a fairly good position, we just want to be able to extend our fingers and our brakes be there. If we have to reach down or reach up really far, that's not great. We always want to have a good wrist position and have it just easily accessible, that brake lever. And you only want to brake if you have any modern bike whatsoever with disc brakes. All you need to brake is your index finger. And where you should be braking from is right at the end of the lever. So you can see here, it's actually a picture of me. I have my fingers right at the very end. There's always a knuckle at the end of that brake lever, and that's going to give you the most amount of leverage. So I know it sounds like kind of a waste to have this whole large lever and you're just using a little bit at the end, but that's what's going to give you the most amount of power. And there's plenty of power, index fingers, disc brakes. It's not 20 years ago when we rode cantilever brakes and we had to go full fists. So yes, there are high profile athletes who brake with their middle fingers. I wouldn't try to correct those people now, late stage in their career, but when I do see kids, younger athletes, adults, beginners, I do try to get them braking with the just index finger, because that leaves them 3 fingers on the bar, and that's very secure and gives them the most stability. I also like to have my hands at the end of my bar. I'm not choked up on the bar, because if you choke up on the bar, I guarantee you probably clip trees with your bars. And what that is your brain knows where your hands are, but it doesn't know that your hands are choked up on a handlebar. So keeping your hands out right at the end of the bar is actually probably going to help you the most with bar strikes. And then you move your brake levers in based on that. So think about that when you're setting up brake levers. Really important for skill development, really important for safety. And so think about those with different ways. And you can also adjust the reach of the brake. So how far in it is. If you have small hands, small fingers, you might actually have to pull those brake levers in a tiny bit. I won't go into how you do that on every single set of bike, every single set of brakes, but you can adjust that reach. So they're very adjustable. There's always a really good way to set those up. A couple more questions. I've used a standard 172.5 crank, and I've always hit my rib cage with my knees in arrow position before I switch to 170. Yes, so that's a big one. It's the same as the pedal stroke and the dead spot. It allows your hips to open up a little bit if you aren't cramped, if you don't have to lift your leg quite as high. So just imagine, Hinkle, if you were riding 180s, which used to actually be fairly common. So think about that. And so maybe even a 165 might even be that much better. So, okay, moving on. So we fit the bike to us. We've adjusted a few things. Now, how do we get the bike working well under us? And two big ones are tire and suspension setup. And so what I like to use for this, whether it's setting up the tires or the suspension, is finding a short single track loop. Has a few corners, maybe a high speed corner, slow speed corners, hopefully a log over, a few compressions, just like a fun, flowy, maybe a little rock garden in there, just something where you can test these things quickly and you can loop back so that you actually have, a pump, your pressure gauge, which is the kind of top right there. That's the most accurate way, because pumps can be very inaccurate, and then a shock pump as well. And so what I do is, and what I have athletes do sometimes, if I'm coaching a youth group, this is usually a night. This is the night early in the year, is I have all these tools and I just send them on a loop and we just play with pressures until the bike feels really good. And every time they do a lap, they just change one thing at a time. So, and we usually start with tires first. So let me back up. So we'll set the tire pressure. We'll get that in a good spot. So we'll usually start kind of high, and I'll have the athletes just lower the tire pressure just a little bit more, and until they feel really good. Maybe then they start to go too low, and the bike feels like or the tires feel like they're starting to fold. Um, and then we kind of go up from there and just find that good sweet spot for tire pressure. And then we move on to suspension. So I'll go back to the quick question: where do you adjust your bite point on the brakes? So that's a tricky one. Depending on the brakes that you have, you might not have a lot of adjustability with that. And it's also there's a lot of personal preference with that. So some athletes like really touchy brakes. So as soon as they start to engage the brakes, there's a very positive feel. Some athletes set them up, I kind of say like kamikaze style, where they're pulling the, brakes and they're really engaging fully almost at the bar itself. So a lot of personal preference there. And if you have that adjustment, I would just play with that, find out what you're comfortable with. I personally like a more positive feel. I like them to be a little bit touchier almost. I like to be able to tap them and know that the brakes are there, brakes are working. It also helps, especially if the brakes start fading and or if the pads start wearing down quickly in a muddy race or that kind of thing. So we set up our tire pressure on our bike. And again, I'm using a full suspension mountain bike here, but this really does apply to cross bikes, hardtails with a fork, um, you know, a wide variety of bikes, maybe not road bikes. But then the next thing we do with suspension is we set the sag, as they call it. And really what this is you're going to put on your clothes, you're going to cycling clothes, you're going to put on your cycling shoes, maybe your pack, whatever you would normally ride with, and you're going to set up the suspension and work with the pressure of the suspension, so the PSI, and to the point that you have about 30% sag. So if your suspension is 100 mil, you're going to go through 30 mils of that travel just sitting on your bike. And actually rolling around the driveway, maybe going in the grass, should be between 20 and 30% of sag. And what that does is it allows the bike to move up and down freely. So you're sitting in the bike, the suspension sagged a little bit. You're not right at the top of the suspension. So the suspension will work both ways, kind of out and in. Hopefully that can make sense. And make sure your lockouts are off to test this as well. So all suspension will have some sort of sag setup. RockShox's great because the scales are built right into the fork stanchion and the suspension, the rear shock. Sometimes some of the other ones you might have to measure a little bit more manually. And so quick one, what are the differences between different brake pads? Good questions. Really quickly, if I broke them up into two really simple ones, you'd have organic pads and metallic pads. Metallic brake pads are going to last a lot longer. They won't feel quite as positive as you use them. They'll still work really, really well. Metallic brake pads still work great, but they might not be quite as touchy or grabby as the organics. So, and that's just simple physics, right? When we go to the organic pads have a softer pad compound. So if you think about soft tires and hard compound tires, the soft tires are going to feel great, have a lot of grip, but they're not going to last as long. So same thing with organic brake pads. They feel great. If you're in dry conditions, you're not riding a lot in mud, those kinds of conditions, then organic all the way. I say I love organic pads, but if it's going to be a muddy race and it's going to be hard on brake pads, usually best to go the metallic brake pad route. So next, after we set up our tire pressure, our sag, we're going to go to rebound. on our suspension. All suspension should have a rebound setting, and that is once you compress the suspension, how quickly does it pop back? And this is a key one because we don't want it to pop back too fast, especially in the rear. As if you're new to jumping and you're trying to learn how to jump, if your rebound's really fast and your weight's not quite in the right place to jump, you can get kicked really easily. You can get kicked over the bars and get bucked, as we say, and that's bucked with a B, just in case it's sounding like something else online. And same thing with the fork. We want to have a good rate of rebound, but not too much, especially if we're riding down a wet trail with a lot of roots. Think about that. Because the suspension will be actually pushing the tire out from under you a little bit. It will actually make things worse. So this is also something that you can play with and adjust not only on your little test loop, but also out on the race course. If the race course has a lot of braking bumps or wet roots, or maybe it's bigger compressions and jumps and things like that, you can kind of start to dial some of these in to suit the race course. If it's wet, I always default to taking off a little bit of rebound and slowing that rebound down a little bit so that my tires aren't as likely to slip out on the roots. So it might feel like the bike's a little bit deader. It might not feel quite as lively, but that's maybe what I want if it's a little bit wetter, wet roots, rocks, those kinds of things, because the bike isn't pushing out on the rocks as much. So all bikes should have that. You can adjust your pressures, play around with front, rear. Rear's generally a little bit higher pressure than the front on tires. Same thing with PSI. A great starting point for the rear shock is your body weight. It's a good starting spot. Fork is usually much lower. I'm 155 pounds ish, and I run my fork about 90 pounds. Whereas I'll start with my rear shock at about 150 and go up or down from there. And usually there's guides online for your suspension. There's usually even guides right on the fork and the shocks themselves, or at least on the forks, that give you some good guidance. Compression. Compression is something that isn't on all suspension. So if you're looking at your fork and your rear shock and there is no compression knobby dial thing, that's okay. It might just not have it. But compression is how fast the suspension is compressing. And it's a similar feel to how much pressure you have, but it's a little bit different. So again, if you have that mode, play around with it. Go back to a practice loop and open it right up or turn it all the way one way. Go do some laps and then turn it all the way the other way and see if there's a difference. See if you can feel a difference in that compression and go with what, generally speaking, if it feels good, if the bike feels like it's in control and sticks to the ground, that's what you want. That's what you're going for. But, in general, just tonight, I just want to familiarize you with these different adjusters. And if we go up bigger bikes, they might even have low speed, high speed compression, low speed, high speed rebound, but we won't get into that tonight. So I have one more slide. If you have any questions, shoot them over now because we are wrapping up soon. Last with suspension, and this is kind of going, kind of another step further, but most suspension is also tunable with volume reducers. So on the left, those gray ones are they're called tokens, and they actually go into a fork. And what they do is they slide into the air chamber, and it reduces the volume of the air chamber of your fork. But really what that's doing is it's ramping up the compression rate through your travel of your fork. So, really quickly, the further down your fork compresses, or your rear shock, the harder it gets to compress your fork so that it ramps up and it almost gives you a bit more of a bottomless feel to the fork. But so let's say you're really aggressive rider, you're a really advanced rider, but you're bottoming out your fork, but you don't want to pump up your fork too hard because then you actually lose some of that small bump sensitivity and the rest of the trail is really rough. So what these volume reducers do is they help kind of navigate that and help preserve that small bump sensitivity so you feel good riding down just a bumpy trail. But then when you do a jump or a drop, you don't feel like your fork's going to explode. The fork ones are fairly straightforward to do. A lot of like home mechanics can do it. It's within that realm. The rear shock volume reducers are a little bit more complicated to swap out, and I wouldn't highly recommend a first timer try to do that. But if you want to experiment with that, talk to your shop, or you might have to send it away for service. And it also helps with if you're a beginner rider, or if you know someone's a beginner rider, they might not have a lot of tokens or you know that kind of thing. It might have a progressive suspension feel, but as you progress and you get more aggressive on a bike and you start really pumping and putting some energy into the bike, that's where volume reducers can really help with the tunability of a bike. So again, thanks for coming in to the webinar. We got a couple more questions, and we will, let me get into it. Is it worth playing around with air spacers in the fork and shock? Do they make a big difference in handling? They do. They make a difference. I don't want to say a big difference. And if you don't, let me put it this way. If I was to put them in your fork and you don't notice a difference, even if I tell you they're there, then you probably don't need them. And you might be better off without them, because that way, if you're not an aggressive rider, you'll get all of the travel. You'll get all of the travel out of your fork and rear shock. And that's really what you want. You want to be able to bottom out your fork and shock, regardless if you have tokens or volume reducers or not. So it is something that is very personal, based on your ability and your, really it comes down to how aggressive you are on the bike. But other than that, like really just stick with the basics. Hone your rebound, hone your compression if you have it, and air pressures. Work on those before you start worrying about volume reducers. How do you know what bar width works? Does having your narrow affect your sprints and climbing? Bar width. So that's another good one. There are some like tests out there. You get in a push-up position, you see how far wide your hands are. A lot of it does come down to personal preference. I don't believe that a narrow bar would affect a sprint too much, especially when we are talking about narrow bars, on the mountain bike, because they're even narrow bars today are wide bars from 20 years ago, and we could still sprint pretty good. Shouldn't really affect your climbing. Climbing should be bar height could, making sure that you can keep some weight on the front wheel. But bar width, I tend to go with the widest bars you feel comfortable with riding your local trails. And meaning, like, even around where I am in Horseshoe Valley, there's a few trails where I have to stop when I ride my trail bike and put my bars through it because I can't ride through it. Whereas if I was to race through that trail, I trim my bars down. My XC bike has narrow bars so that I know I can fit through trails. Another quick one. What percentage of total weight should be on the front versus rear tire? Good one. If you are seated, that's a really good question. It's kind of hard to answer. If you're seated, you probably have more than 50%. You probably have about 60% on the rear tire than the front wheel if you're just at a seated position on level ground. But generally speaking, if you're mountain biking and you're, in an aggressive position and the trail's getting a little bit gnarly, your weight should almost be, your center of mass should be between the two wheels and almost equally distributed between the two wheels when things start to get kind of gnarly. So that's kind of going into bike skills and bike position. But yeah, if you're just sitting on a bike, you're gonna have a little bit more weight on the rear wheel for sure. Tire inserts. I haven't used tire inserts yet. I'm intrigued by the idea. Yes, it probably does depend on where you're riding. And if you're riding and you're getting a lot of pinch flats, if it's really rocky, then yeah, I think tire inserts could play a big role. If where you're riding isn't very rocky, there's not a lot of things to pinch flat on, then you might not necessarily consider it. So, but when I think of Ontario, I think of like Elliott Lake. is a place where way up north they used to have an oak up there. I would want tire inserts. I wish they were invented 10 years ago. Um, but if you're at Albion or I want to say hardwood, but maybe not on the Pan Am features, you're probably okay with omitting the tire inserts. But definitely a neat idea. I do want to experiment with them. But you are adding some rotational weight to your wheels. You are adding, up to 100 grams of wheel, which does add up. So you want to make sure it's something that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Is kind of my philosophy. So I haven't got too many pinch flats riding around in Ontario. Okay, so thank you very much for joining in tonight. If you like this webinar, like my Facebook page. That's the best way to be notified of my future webinars. But generally speaking, Monday nights, 7 p.m., I'll always think of something to go on about. And if you liked it, tell a friend, tell a few friends, and hopefully I can pass along whatever information that I can to help everyone's riding. And that's kind of my main goal with these webinars. So again, thank you for joining in tonight. If you have any questions or if you have any topics for a webinar or something that you'd like me to speak to, just shoot me an email. Give me some ideas. I have a good list, but I might run out in a few weeks. So feel free to reach out. Okay, thank you very much. Have an excellent week, everyone. Stay safe, stay healthy, and hopefully we all get out on the race course soon.